So in today's episode, we're going to be doing a musical analysis of Ray Steadman-Allen's The Holy War. We're going to be using the original Bernard Adams recording from 1965 at the Albert Hall to play examples during this podcast, and I'm joined by Dr. Howard Evans. As we go through this piece of music, we're going to be following this score. You may find it useful to follow a score yourself, and you can download a score from the Salvation Army Music Index online, and I believe there are even some discount codes for fully scored listeners. Don't say we don't look after you. To start us off, Howard, can you give us a bit of a background to the piece of music and when it was written and how it changed over time?
That's a really interesting question, and we could probably spend most of the time of the discussion going through that. I think we tend to think of RSA as being able to just write and get it all down. I think the fascinating thing with The Holy War, I don't know how I came across some of these things, but some time ago I was sent an original version of a recording as far back as 1958. It was while RSA was still with the Tottenham Citadel Band, and the initial draft and first version of Holy War was actually played through by the then Tottenham Citadel Band. And it sounds as though it might have been an old reel-to-reel because it gets a bit squeaky at times, but there is a version of the original Holy War that RSA tried out. If you read RSA's biography, it's actually detailed in there that he did in fact do that, and that is actually verified. For me, it's kind of always important to try and make sure that Salvation Army-wise we're not just always talking anecdotally, but it is actually verified in RSA's biography that he was working on it as far back as 1958. Also in the biography, it's also detailed that in the early 60s, Gordon Hill mentions the fact that Ray turned up with a second version of The Holy War at a staff band rehearsal. I don't know whether there's any record of that that exists anywhere, but the original certainly exists. So by 1965, and the sort of final version of this piece, we actually get to something that Ray has possibly been working on for quite a long time. People talk about this particular composition in terms of its integrity, the way it all seems absolutely right, and yet it's fascinating in that even for somebody of RSA's mind, there was obviously a huge compositional process to go through to get it right and to get it to what we actually see on the printed score these days. It's just a pity we obviously can't go back and talk to Ray about those processes and exactly what happened and how he arrived at those conclusions. The interesting thing from the original recording that I've obviously listened to and compared with the new score is that there are huge chunks of the original that are completely jettisoned. There are chunks that appear in the Holy War as it is printed, but they're in a completely different place.
And this is pure programmatic music. It's telling a story, and it's based on the John Bunyan book, The Holy War. Could you tell us perhaps a little bit about the storyline that this music is following?
Well, the storyline, it's about Mansell and his journey through life and through the town. I forget what the name of the town is. In fact, the interesting thing about preparing for this was that I decided that I actually needed to read Bunyan's The Holy War. So yesterday I actually just ordered a copy so that I have more of an understanding of what's actually going on here. Because I think we've all read Pilgrim's Progress. I mean, that's what RSA says in the notes, and he gives the programmatic description at the beginning. He does talk about the style being sort of quite heavy, but is the number of allegorical characters linking, a lot of it links to the words of Paul, and we're dealing with the town of Mansell, which is in divine keeping, but Diabolus occupies the town, and we find all sorts of other characters. There's great names: Captain's Judgment, Captain Conviction, the Lord Mayor Incredulity, Mr. Lustings, some Diabolonians. It's kind of fascinating language that's very, very descriptive. RSA does say that he doesn't necessarily follow the kind of sort of story of the book. there's a sense in which it represents certain facets. It does have a sense of climax in terms of where it's going, but it's not a complete programmatic description of the story of the book. But that's its background and where it comes from. And I hope in days to come I find out a little bit more about that.
Fantastic. And this piece is performed, first of all, at the Royal Albert Hall in 1965, I believe, celebrating the centenary of the Salvation Army. It didn't go down that smoothly with some people. There was a standing ovation for the piece, but there was also quite a lot of criticism on behalf of this music being so avant-garde for the time.
There was, when you look at it these days, you kind of sort of wonder what was avant-garde. There's the famous chord that comes in letter O for the end of that section before the final sort of triumphant little bit, that sort of that huge discord that RSA builds up through there that he uses. And yet, actually, when you listen to it, a lot of the music is not discordant. I think the element that probably takes people by surprise is the sort of the space of some of the melodic intervals. Unlike that, the opening motive. I suspect that kind of language at that time and these slightly more awkward intervals, both to sing, if you like, and to play, sort of make it more difficult. Programmatically, there is so much to hang your thoughts on. I don't get why you can't follow where it's going. Although something that is as complex and as detailed as this on first hearing requires work and study and understanding to get to know and to love it. You can't, in terms of the Luther chorale, you can't get more diatonic than Ein fester Berg, can you? What's the issue with it? And so in that way, the kind of reactions at the time, kind of historically looking back at it now, it's kind of fascinating to understand why some of that reaction was there to this particular music. I suppose because the tunes and the melodic input is far more motivic derived on kind of almost a symphonic scale, makes it very different for some of the listeners of that day to kind of sort of be able to appreciate and to understand.
Excellent. And it's just film music, really, isn't it now? You wouldn't bat an eyelid if John Williams, Hans Zimmer did this similar thing in music nowadays. It just shows how much it's changed.
It is, although I would go with the film music. In fact, the best film music is very motivic developed and is fascinating in terms of the way it kind of sort of, from my point of view, I think in kind of music circles, some people would look at some of the development of film music as having come from sort of Wagner and the Ring Cycle and the sort of motivic aspects that appear with certain characters. In highly developed film music, you actually still get that. You can almost see that as an extension of that. And in that way, you can see RSA's work in that line as being kind of highly developed in that kind of way. I'm just very careful how I would use the term film music because I think it covers a multitude of sins.
Yes, that's a big umbrella term. Let's actually delve into the music now and go through the score. Grand fanfare in the timpani part and these triplet fanfares moving forwards. Could you talk us a bit through what happens in the music?
Well, in the music, we're looking at the powers of the good, the sense of divine security. There's a whole kind of, how can I put it? There's a sort of strength to these opening motives. And he introduces these motives, the motive of the fourth going up. We have the sort of motive going down, which and this is where he starts to use all of these particular motives and these motive cells and the bass figure in the second bar and the fanfare figure in the trombones become kind of really important motives as far as the music is concerned and the way that they're actually developed.
Fantastic. And it's interesting to note, I've offended percussionists in the past on this podcast, but RSA does say in the score notes that percussion is absolutely vital to this piece of music.
Yep.
And it's really used heavily throughout. So after we've had that grand opening, we move into letter A. Could you talk us through what happens in letter A?
Letter A is interesting. On a structural level, we can probably and possibly identify this. You've got the introduction that starts at right at the beginning, and then into letter A, kind of A through letter C. We can talk about kind of sort of being musically. We can talk about it being the exposition of the work, whereby we get the major themes. We get the major theme. We get the faith theme. Letter A, which is presented in the basis, which is an inversion. And this is the thing, everything seems to come from somewhere. It's not just kind of arbitrary. And that for me is fascinating. And I think from a listener's point of view, even if you don't know that or understand that, that's why sometimes the music seems so integrated, because of the relationship that comes. So we get the faith motive that comes through at letter A and is then also developed at letter B. We get it in the trombones, but it's an inversion of that opening theme. It almost feels as though if you're setting out on your journey, everything's great, everything's good, and you're setting out on your journey through there. And through here, the interesting thing, when you analyse the score, I mean, I've got mine marked up, you've got lots of canonic imitation. You get sort of 3-bar introduction at letter A, then you get the tune in the baritones euphoniums for 4 bars, then you get the sort of modulatory, and you get the tune appearing in a kind of in just a very slightly different version if you look at the actual notation in the first bar in the horns and the first baritone. Then it gets compressed, which sort of gives it a sense of energy. You get a 2-bar phrase in the horns taken up by a 2-bar phrase in the baritones euphoniums, which kind of sort of seems to move the music on the way you get all those canonic imitations. He takes the opening fragment and then uses that and gets the music to move forward through there. Letter B, we have the faith theme come again through the trombones, and again it keeps getting taken up with interjections. And what we get at letter B, ba-da-ba-bee-ba-bam, you get that fragment, which if you don't know it, it's easier. It's really interesting when you look later. And this is why, as far as the compositional process is concerned, that's really interesting. What came first? So if the tune and if the chorale tune that he wanted to be central, which actually ends up in the final version, ends up being kind of part of the central part of the work, we get this foreshadowing of it here. When RSA mapped this out, did he know that? And is that why you get that foreshadowing? You know, how much of that is intentional? Where was it in the compositional process? So, you know, was this part of the writing in terms of the integration of that after he'd already decided exactly what was going on there? There's a huge mixture of what's actually happening, but you get in the accompaniment that you get the foreshadowing of that. Let us see again. You also get those chorale allusions.
Fantastic.
Big cornet stuff coming. So, you know, as well as the main faith theme still coming through there.
Excellent. So that brings us, as you said, to letter C, where we have a bit more of a substantial reference to the Lutheran chorale Ein Feste Burg.
Yep.
Could you tell us a bit about the history of that tune, Ein Feste Burg?
I mean, the main aspect of this is that, I suppose contextually, the interesting thing is we're looking at Luther and Luther's chorale, and a whole new concept of worship and exactly what was happening, and this Luther chorale almost kind of sort of, I suppose you're making me think about it, maybe it kind of sort of takes us into the period of sort of Bunyan's actual book. There's a kind of sort of, you know, the whole allegorical thing with Bunyan's book and where that comes from. Maybe it's almost a period piece in the music there. Does he say something about it in there?
I was just going to read the words associated from it are taken from Psalm 46, It's a safe stronghold, our God is still, a trusty shield and weapon. He'll help us clear from all the ill that hath us now o'ertaken. The ancient prince of hell hath risen with purpose fell. Strong mail of craft and power he weareth in this hour. On earth is not his fellow. So quite old-fashioned.
It's very
words
old. It's
in
very
this day.
old-fashioned words. I have actually. I did this piece a number of years ago for one of, I forget which celebration it was, with Boscombe. And to make sense of playing this piece later on in the programme, we actually started with the song at an earlier point in the programme. And even the latest versions that we have in our songbooks can appear a little bit old-fashioned. But it's that whole concept. If this whole opening, which we said right at the beginning, it's the powers of good, it's that whole sense of divine security, those chorale allusions give that whole sense of strength and divine security, and that's exactly what those words say. And that's, I guess that's the programmatic reason as well as the motivic reason. I think that's where those things always combine in that kind of way to create the kind of the tautness of the composition, and works in that way.
And even though this piece is through composed, not in distinct movements, at letter D we move into what could be seen as the second part of this piece, which Ray Steadman-Allen describes as the satanic wiles and threats.
That's what I've got written in my score, Old Serpent. He uses the description of the Old Serpent and the satanic wiles. From a compositional, from a programmatic point of view, yes. The interesting thing is it's also suggested, I mean, if people are interested in actually reading up a very detailed analysis of this, there are two sources that they can go to. RSA's biography, in the appendices, there's a really, really good analysis by Dudley Bright. Great army writer, composer in that kind of way, super trombone player, and also happens to be a good friend. But Dudley's analysis is absolutely super. The other book has to be Ron Holtz's second book, History of Salvation Army Bands, because in one of the chapters there, in the large-scale concert works, he also gives an analysis of RSA's Holy War. They both identify the same kinds of things. Dudley's, I find, is just slightly more detailed in that Dudley finds more musical cells out of some of the motives and the way some of those are developed, and identifies a lot of very small motivic figures that come throughout the work. And it makes logical sense when you read his analysis to where some of these small cells have come from. The interesting thing, I think, is that there is a suggestion that letter D, because when we're talking about kind of sort of sonata form as such, which is often, and the whole concept of sort of symphonic form as well, you're often talking about expositions. There's almost a suggestion that this actually could be your contrasting second subject here at letter D. So having had the first subject and the faith motive, here is your completely contrasting second subject. On a symphonic level, it works. It's exactly that. And it's this duet, sort of slightly vivacious, I think, possibly. It's this coaxing term that he uses in the rubato, and it's almost that we're starting to be tempted by serpent wiles here. I mean, Ray in his notes talks about the illusion of the serpent. As soon as we think about that, the picture that we have in our mind is the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and the serpent beguiling the woman and the woman beguiling the man. And so I'm not sure whether the cornet or the trombone is the serpent. You can make up your own conclusions on that.
Definitely go trombone.
while I don't think I'm plucking things out of the air there, Ray's descriptions and those kind of things. So that whole symphonic level of the two completely contrasting, often a second subject is a completely contrasting subject that gives you new material to develop. You have that here, and Ray's allusion to the serpent tells you exactly, I think, what this is meant to be, and in the town of Mansell, and exactly what's going on.
So then we move through that more chromatic section and continue it at letter E. Could you talk us through what happens here musically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the way he sort of, again, develops these motifs. What we get here at letter E is we get that ti-da-pam-pa-pam. We get the development of that at letter E, and we actually get Mansell turned upside down almost. Ti-da-pam-pam. You can see the intervals of that and the way that works, and the way that he kind of sort of reverses some of those elements that we've had earlier to kind of sort of form the basis and to use this as some of the tunes through here. The interesting thing, I've spoken a couple of times about this, and this is where this is so much more highly developed. The solo in the original version, this starts off a little bit like this, but goes off in a completely different direction as far as the solo is concerned here. It's one of the kind of sort of fascinating things. The genesis of this particular section is there in the original version, but it's not quite developed in the way that it is here. And I think this is developed into a longer section and a longer dialogue, the way he moves through here.
Moving on towards letter F, just before we get to F, once again in the baritones we have a reference to the Lutheran chorale, and we have this change in music. Can you describe this change and what this means to the story?
We almost have a sort of little... sometimes when you move musically from one thing to another, you just need a kind of sort of it's almost like a little bit of reflection as to what's going on through here. And again, I think there are just so many motivic little bits that come from all over the place. You get that diminished fourth interval before F that we've had before, that we have at the beginning with the R tempo. You have that kind of pleading motif here in the solo cornet that we then get in the flugel, that then moves us into a new section, this kind of threatening menace, this violence and menace. This section appears to be completely missing from the original. And then letter G, it's really interesting. What we get, which is like the central section of this sort of development into the kind of sort of development and into the battle bit, where we get the moment of reflection and the closing, if you like, of the exposition with the chorale, and then moves into the battle bit. This particular section with the chorale comes very much later. The material that we actually have that's marked in the score here at letter R, which is quite late on, it's after that material that we get some of the chorale material that we hear right here in the middle. Really interesting kind of sort of juxtaposition and change in terms of where some of this originally was. We move into this with the kind of sort of motivic stuff. We have that same interval in the trombone to take us into letter G. You get the sense of something happening in the background of letter F. You get the reflection of the chorale and beautiful, lovely little harmonizations of the chorale and the scoring of this and the way this actually works. Absolutely super through there. And then it's all suddenly messed up by the battle and the war and the development. Letter H. The interesting thing, again, some of this little bit of letter H is there, but he develops it very differently. if you look at the turmoil and the figures here, the bass figure that we have here, if you take out two of the last two semiquavers of the bass motive at letter H, and you take the opening crotchet tied to the first semiquaver, the second semiquaver, and then the next crotchet, again you get that whole motivic development whereby that's actually a Mansol figure right from the beginning, but he's developed it in a different way. Those two extra notes kind of sort of hide it to a degree, but the intrinsic intervals are there, and he develops it in a different way and takes us, and it becomes kind of, it sets us off on that battle theme, and again sort of get that figure sort of gets answered in some of the upper parts in the way that he kind of sort of takes us into this battle through here.
And the storyline, as we said, this piece is based on the Holy War, the book.
Yep.
Do you think there could be seen to be parallels between the narrative of this book and our lives as Christians as well? Do you think that might be part of the inspiration for this piece of music?
I think this piece, for me, this piece is very much in what I would call the Salvation Army tradition of programmatic pieces that give us an overall picture, an overall story that is specific in its own way, but has so much relevance and can be applied in so many other ways. I mean, the other piece that comes to mind that does the same kind of programmatic journey in a different way is Les Condon's Present Age. And I think it's really interesting because where's the later development that we've got of these kind of pieces? Where are the pieces that we've got that seek to kind of give us these broad stroke pictures that in some ways have their own story and detail? The music for me doesn't always depend on that story and the detail, but it's the way it kind of sort of takes you on both a kind of sort of symphonic musical journey that does have its programmatic element, but it's that sense of overarching kind of architecture as to where it takes you that is a logical consequence. I think the compositional process of that is part of that, and I think as far as the compositional processes are concerned these days, I'm not sure that we have symphonic works like this that do that in quite the same way. We have lots of programmatic works and lots of programmatic works that give us an A-B-A structure with an energetic first section, a reflective middle section, and then a reworking or another development that takes us into a big conclusion. We don't quite have these days, I think, this genre of work that I'm aware of. Please make me aware of it if it's my fault. But this kind of overarching sort of structure that takes us on those kind of journeys. And there is very much a Salvation Army tradition of those kind of works.
And do you think in Salvation Army music there's still scope for that genre, or do you think in today's age that genre has had its time and we should be looking at different genres to approach, or do you think that there should be a revival of that style?
On a personal level, I would like to think there is still scope for that kind of genre. And I wish I had more time for writing. I don't actually physically get enough time for writing. The whole process of what happens for me takes a long time.
Howard, could we dive right back in through letter H and have a look at what the music is doing here?
Yeah, I mean, from here we start this sort of development thing into the battle scene, although the battle music and the sense of conflict actually starts at letter J. It's just the kind of preamble that sets that up musically. And we have this lovely invocation. We've had at letter G the introduction of the chorale, and we get these fragments of the chorale in the kind of context of Bunyan and that particular era. It's almost like if you want to use your imaginations, you get these fragments of the chorale before letter J. It's almost like the knight having his vigil before he goes out to battle the following day. You can see him in his armour and his helmet and his sword and maybe kneeling at the altar. It's almost a moment of prayer It's actually marked solemnly at the top of the score there in Italian. I just didn't pronounce it in Italian. And you get the fragments of the chorale, and then it's almost like the last little bit of the chorale, the fanfare bit of the chorale with the cornets and trombones, is almost like a sort of clarity of purpose about getting out and going on your way. And we move into this battle music. Some of the battle music here at letter J, I've spoken previously about the original version. Some of this is here is very different. There's actually a lot of percussion work. If I recall some of the sounds of the original version, there was actually quite a lot more solo percussion work at the start of this battle scene, as if sort of setting it all off. So Ray obviously had second thoughts about that.
Don't want them getting too excited.
No, don't want the percussionists getting too excited. And we get these motifs that sort of come through that answer this sort of insistent trombone stuff. The percussion work here is actually really important, and the whole thing sort of keeps building and takes us through to letter K. The interesting thing through here as well is that the tempo keeps pushing. It's very interesting listening to recordings of this particular work and the battle scene here, and comparing different recordings with different speeds. Ray actually says allegro ma non troppo, not too fast. Crotchet equals 104. Most of the recordings that I've listened to tend to start this slightly quicker and get the energy going. And some of them, whilst the accelerandos, the sort of real climax comes at the stringendo and into M and further on, so that before letter N we end up at a crotchet equals 176. Actually, some performances actually get there quite a bit sooner than that in terms of the vigour and the energy that goes into this. Quite an interesting kind of aspect of the whole sense of performance practice and how we sort of get influenced by other recordings. It's very interesting to sometimes start from a fresh and double check our metronome marks as to what the composer is actually wanting and meaning here. So maybe he's not wanting it to start sort of quite in your face, although some of the music is in your face. There is a sort of threat to the opening of that section in terms of the way he sort of keeps it down, takes some of the volume directions away and makes that work.
Through to letter K.
Yep.
Could you talk us through a little bit of the development of the themes here in K?
Yeah, the themes here in K, I think there's all sorts of little bits through here. Lap, pap, hum. You get that again that comes from one of the cells that we get earlier on in the piece. Again, if you look at Dudley's analysis of where that comes from, but it's also integrated into that interval there at letter K, is that T-dum, is that diminished fourth interval. It's sort of quite clearly written like that. Take out the D and you get that pattern of the diminished fourth interval. You get some of the kind of sort of inverted D-da-ba-beam. You get some of those inverted mansol figures through here. There's so many fragments. The third interval, which features quite heavily, we get that quite a lot through here. It all plays its part in some of the fragmentary material, the decorative material. And then at before letter L, we get our main theme, our faith theme, bam. We get that coming in. It's part of the battle scene. It's also inverted above that. Again, there is just so much detail. We could spend hours analysing every bar and the kind of sort of motivic detail as to what's actually going on there. And some of it is compressed. You get answers that come straight away. You get and then you get sort of bar after bar where it comes through. And the music starts to pick up energy and sort of gets developed through there. We get that diminished fourth interval again at the stringendo. We get the inverted before letter M, D, pa, 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 pum. We get that inverted interval again. We get the minor third intervals that feature quite heavily, that then give us, it moves us on the intervals and the compression, the rhythmic compression and the harmonic compression at letter M keep driving us forward. So there's lots of compositional devices through here in terms of the way themes and motives are shortened and fragmented, harmonically shift more quickly, that then gives us this whole sense of the kind of sort of conflict and everything moving through. Fascinating.
It is.
Yeah,
It is.
it's. I mean, we could just spend so much time sort of going through it in terms of what's happening to it all.
So that takes us through after the dialogue we've had between the two forces of good and evil in section M. That takes us through to letter M, where the style changes again, and we have some recapitulations of the opening, the happy and joyous themes.
It's almost a bit like a recapitulation, but it's still part of the battle. Sort of musically, the kind of sort of structure. It's in the euphonium of the baritone there, which kind of sort of mirrors sort of what happened sort of earlier on in terms of what happens at the beginning, and so it's kind of sort of part recapitulation, but this part recapitulation is still part of programmatically the battle scene, whereby it's almost that sort of man-soul and our faith motive is asserting itself, but we get this final bit of venom. Trombones, I think, are supposed to be very good at venom. So the trombones have the venom at letter O, and then we get this kind of sort of fascinating chord that sort of brings us through to this sort of risoluto and this sort of the motive in the kind of sort of extended rhythmic form, the cluster chord of this development. Everybody talks about this cluster chord. Ron Holtz, in his analysis, says it reminds one of Richard Strauss's atonal battle music, and that the spiritual warfare reaches its peak with this grand chord. And he describes this grand chord as probably being the chord cluster that certainly shocked the saints in 1965. That's a great description about that, and he's got a great analysis of the way that chord works and where it comes, all those sort of semitones, the way they're clustered against each other. Between some of the different intervals, you still get that augmented fourth interval and way that works. The augmented fourth interval, of course, sometimes, or diminished fifth interval, depending on which way you want to look at it, sometimes having been described as the devil's chord in classical music. So maybe some of those intervals kind of sort of come from that. That's the sort of diabolus in the music, and sort of takes its inspiration from there. We then get the faith motive coming again in a resolute passage. We also get again the chorale, the fragment of the chorale, dim pam 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 ta tam, but in a much stronger way. There's this sort of there's this strength to that, and it moves into the dignified tam pam pam, the opening theme, the second motive of the opening theme at the condignata comes again based around the fifth and the fourth, that opening theme. That sense of resolution comes, and then in the aftermath we have letter Q, we have these kind of sort of moments of reflection. It's like the sort of grey dawn. Everything, the sort of nighttime, the darkness of the nighttime has passed, and we get this mysterious and quiet aftermath. I think RSA describes it as the grey dawn that we get through there, the mysterious chord figures, the inverted figure that we get in this lovely, and baritone players don't always love this solo.
Wow, it's a bit pearly, isn't it?
It's a very pitching those A's and then pitching the second interval from the E up to the B would be any baritone player's nemesis. Absolutely. Even these days. At this stage of the work, there's a performance discipline that comes to having a fresh pair of chops there to be able to do that and to make that happen. And but again, that's that cell that kind of gets restored that we find there in that particular moment there. So it's really important motivically, but it's important programmatically in terms of sort of bringing back to our roots. Tee-dum-pum-pum-pa-pum. That figure is fascinating because then ta-dum-pum-pum, tee-da-pa-pa. That figure from the chorale that is taken from the chorale then becomes compressed even more, and the letter R becomes these bell-like figures. Tee-da-pa-pa. That rhythmic inflection that suddenly changes it. Pum-tum-tum, teem-pum-pum, tee-dum-pum. It's fascinating the way that just comes out of that. When you hear it, you don't always see or hear that, but when you actually analyse those cells and those motives, that's exactly where it comes from. And the chorale becomes transformed into those bell-like figures that then kind of have even more bell-like stuff that's attracted to them before the sense of jubilation. And quite rightly, the climax of the tune is letter S, and the tune becomes really important, this whole movement around it. Interestingly, in the original version that I heard, RSA uses the trombones in unison for this particular section to start it. It's not nearly so highly decorated, but the trombones, of course, he was a trombone player himself, but there's this huge jubilation, and the bell-like figures that come out of the chorale then lead us into the chorale itself and the jubilation at letter S.
And I believe the musically technical term for trombones in unison is the paint stripper manoeuvre. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, better keep that to yourself. Yes, it is a chorale. It needs to sound, I was going to say it needs to sound more organ-like, but then I've heard some tromba stops on some organs that would sound like trombones that are paint stripping. So apologies to all you fine trombonists out there.
And would it be fair to draw a comparison between the carillon of the bell sounds that RSA is depicting here at letter S and perhaps the final movements of
the carillon comes just before that, doesn't it? The carillon comes just before letter S, and then it's the tune. But yes, I mean the sense of bells are always the sense of bells is always a celebratory thing, isn't it? You know. And you're thinking about the Great Gate of Kiev and the bells that suddenly come, the big tune that suddenly comes at the end there, and the sense of bells. Yeah, I mean, there's a great parallel with that. say, I suppose musically, he closes it off. We end up with a little coda after we've had all the recapitulatory material. The chorale is both part of the recapitulation in the way that it comes at the end of the exposition. It comes towards the end of this kind of recapitulation music, and we then move into letter U with what has to be a summation and a little coda that pulls together these things and pulls together our motives again. We get our opening motive come back, and there's so much kind of sort of self-quotation from the music that comes through here, as well as the scalic passages that we get. And baritones, euphoniums start off 2 bars from the horns. It then gets developed. We get the fanfare figures from the end that give us these final triumphal fanfare figures, as if they really are triumphing. Once you've undertaken a journey like that, the material that you've had at the beginning becomes different at the end and takes on a different meaning. And we get that opening motive that we get in the cornets and trombones. We get it here through the middle of letter U in that final peroration and the final chords there. Some lovely modulations towards the end, and even in the final phrases in the basses, ba-da-ba-ba-ba, that lovely figure just coming and reinserting itself once more. I think for basses, for tuba players at that time in Salvation Army bands, it would have been quite unique to find something as blooming awkward as that to get your chops round and to be playing, but it's right there at the end and brings it to a great conclusion as far as the piece is concerned. Great integrity in terms of the structures and great compositional detail in terms of the way the whole thing is put together, but something that creates this great programmatic picture and journey that he takes us on, but just so integrated and kind of almost perfect. But he took a long time to get there. And maybe if there is anything for all of us who write, I think the lesson there is that sometimes if we were to listen to what we do first time, if we were able, and the difficulty, and this is kind of going off slightly at tangent, but the computer will reproduce what we write perfectly these days. There is nothing like putting a composition on a live band, finding somebody to read it through for you, and you soon find out what works and doesn't work and what has integrity and what doesn't have integrity. The computer plays it perfectly and realizes it for you in such a way that you think is absolutely fine. Actually, half the time it's a load of rubbish. And sometimes we need to learn to hear from some of the rubbish that we write, go back to the drawing board, take what's right and work a little bit harder at some of the things that we do. And I think the lesson for lots of us on this is actually finding structural and compositional integrity in what we do. Whatever we're trying to say, what we're trying to say is important, but the vehicle by which we say that makes it either work or pulls the rug from under our feet. Because if the vehicle by which we say it and by which we put those things together is even stronger, then what we say is even stronger as a result. And that's why this piece works. And I think that's probably why this is a timeless piece of RSA's that still has that huge impact whenever you listen to it, and is still a tour de force. We play so many things that have so many effects in them these days. Sometimes when it comes to playing dots and notes like this, where every note has to be in place, we can't get away with fudging it.
Not the classic 3-2-1, 3-2-1 on the bass.
No, make it happen. Go blue there, guys. That will work. Doesn't work with this. It's absolutely super. It's absolutely brilliant.